Perspective Podcast.
And we're live.
Live, yeah. I like the new recording in progress thing. It's like in your face, recording in progress.
It's good to be notified when you're being recorded and watched.
Like in public too, you think? You're being watched, Rocco.
Especially in public, but also when in designatedly privately shared spaces as well.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Which is this thing, this conversation as a recording is now called a podcast, but it's just a conversation. I think that's a really cool format of medium and expression. It's just like, oh, nothing's going on here. We're just recording what would maybe already happen if we weren't recording it.
Right. What do you think about that? You think that when we recorded that we, kind of behave in the same way as when we're not recorded?
Man.
I mean, I think our conversation between you and I probably would just be this way anyway. But do you think our conversation would change? Our conversation changes when we're, being watched, or, or talking to one another in a particular way, right?
Well,
like maybe on camera, like we're, namaste, but then we're like, this guy gave me a fucking parking ticket. So
yeah.
Well, does that change?
That's a great angle of beginning, because I think that's a primary theme of what you and I would call the tapestry of conversation that has already been here between us, but also something that I'm blissful and excited and joyous to dialogue with you of all people about, which is dharma oriented versus just waste of time oriented. The question was would this be different if it wasn't recorded? Between these two, maybe not, but I think when things are dialed in towards which, let me give a quick little reframe. So I met this human named Duprey because he was teaching a yoga, or he was a teacher amongst a yoga teacher training scenario. And he stood out to me amongst the people that were there, and I wanted to learn more and have been learning with and from the topic of yoga, Raja Yoga, Kriya Yoga, and sadhana, and all these fun things that have totally reoriented my entire life. And at the end of the day, it's always comes back to just how's your base level state of consciousness? So I think I've always appreciated that with you, of just being cool, fantastic. That's all satellite up there, but boots on the ground, how's it going? What's going on? I think, not everybody is having conversations in a dharmically expansive format, which is a huge part of why I got inspired and constantly a prickle in my neck over the course of a couple of years to do a podcast. Because it's man, I'm curious in my conversations, and I'm not talking. I don't have time to just talk with people. If I can feel the exchange is just third density, I'm honestly sub-audibly, detracted or quantumly uninterested. I can just feel there's nothing here. And that's not nothing against anybody in particular. It's just I've come to this tangible experience with my soul that there's only so much time to do anything, let alone talk. And so if a conversation can be expansive and beneficial, then beautiful. And I don't think anybody, I didn't want to create a podcast for no reason. It was around these conversations around, call it spirituality, which, by the way, at most recent one of these recent statements that have stood out to me is just there's no such thing as spirituality. There's just no such thing. It's not actually a place or a thing, unless you're hyper third density identified and you need a spiritual place to funnel your attention upwards out of the mundane and into. But once that's kind of the mundane, then that all there is spirituality. But long story short, I think having attention recorded and having consciousness deliberately processed as an artistic expression or a medium of some kind, whether it's called art or just craft or whatever. But podcast, I do think it augments our our attention. If I was just calling you and this was like a, you know, a session and I was getting my teacher training points, I'd probably be, you know, we'd be going over a journal, or we'd be maybe talking about
Sure.
these unending triggers in life, and maybe more privately, you know, known issues I have with people in my life and stuff like that. So having a public format to a private conversation, I do feel like that augments things, don't you?
Yeah, I think it puts you on I think in some ways it gives you room to talk about things that you wouldn't normally talk about. Like in some, you know, humble type of communication, you can get into all the, you know, gritty stuff, or the ruts, as you put it, or, you know, yogically, samskara, whatever we're talking about. And when we're like in a public forum, we're looking at, well, what's kind of the upper ends of that, right? When maybe it's not like airing our laundry out, but we'll talk about how we fold it instead, you know, something like that.
That's nice. That's nice. That's a nice throw in there. Okay, cool.
But it always is interesting to me because, you know, being so long a yoga educator, I always wonder why, you know, people come into yoga classrooms and they're, you know, overall they're quite polite and like nice, and they roll their mat out and they're like, you know, but then like outside it's another story, right?
The chatty
Um,
Cathy's emerge.
Yeah, or just like I remember I was at a Sunday mass with a friend of mine who is, you know, parents are religious, so we just go along, whatever, you know, check out what's going on with religion and stuff. And the priest, the father, was like, you know, you guys are all, you know, peace be with you, shaking hands and stuff. And then the end of the sermon, and you guys are all trying to run each other over in the driveway to see who gets out first. And I thought that was really interesting because in yoga, we, you know, or spirituality, whatever you want to call it, when we're in particular scenarios, potentially having high conversations, or, you know, in particular groups, are, you know, the behavior shifts a lot. And it's something that I noticed, and, you know, trying to tie this back into what we were talking about earlier, it's something I noticed from quite a young age, is like how when we move into these different roles, that essentially your position does change, of course, but like the persona of the person doesn't necessarily have to change so much. So for instance, like your good student face, as you put it, is going to like talk about these particular things, but your interviewer face is going to like talk about these particular things. So being like a writer for most of my life, I was always interested in like how something very like mundane could be so impactful. And you know, it can like a washer, you know, that you would use on a sink be just as potent as like, you know, a crystal you found at Lechugia? Like, can they be of equal value? And so, you know, a lot of that's why I asked that conversation, is like a lot of times when we have conversation, I always think that, you know, kind of the boring stuff is actually more interesting than this quote unquote interesting stuff, because it goes a lot further in our life. We use it a lot more regularly, like that baseline. So
that reminds me of this phrase that I've been hearing my father say often on Facebook Lives and other media express tangents. He's like, nothing is sacred, and if it is, I'll fix it. And I hear this little like almost like a Raja Yoga Siddha koan happen in my brain, because I know that he thinks many things are sacred, but
sure,
that statement is kind of a poke at those who are tight-assed, or like, you know, scrunched up into their own conformity. And I see a very a yogic kind of disruptor teacher archetype in him often, of like stimulating a space just to like cause a ripple and then allow nature to kind of relax and get out of its head. Or, you know, he says that to people who might like look to him and have like a conversation in their mind, which is like, let's talk about this. And he's like, scramble, scramble, scramble. How about now, after things have been scrambled? How about now? Let's start from the scramble instead of the organized identity posture.
Yeah, I think that organization can be quite dangerous, actually. We look at like the spiritual world, as you mentioned it, so I'm using that terminology now, is that a lot of my issue with that posturing is that sometimes it often approaches people as if something's lacking. So if you look at like yoga, for instance, and I'm just throwing out there, I have nothing against the chakras, but I'm just like throwing it out there. Like a lot of times there's a posturing of like, well, this is sort of not happening for you energetically, so therefore your chakras must be imbalanced. But when we like really dive into text or scripture, or even if you meditate on those areas in your body, you'll notice that they're not out of balance. Like they're and quite possibly they never could be out of balance, for the fact that your energy it's like saying like, well, I noticed that like blood is not flowing into your left arm, like, so it's probably because you have poor relationships, right? It's like even in those scenarios, I'm not saying there's not like psychosomatic relationships or somatic relationships to like trauma or negative, but we're talking about really intense things that we basically take really small things and apply those things onto those intense things, such as like, well, you might be not so great at relationships, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your like energetic system's out of balance, right? Or that you might be dealing with all these things, but it doesn't mean that you're spiritually misaligned, right? Because if we're talking about like dharma and you're talking about karma, then essentially all of your collective experiences, whether they're negative or positive, lead you to where you're going, and they're meant to be had, right?
I have a door handle from that, may I?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Because as you've been a hyper ultra augmenting mirror in my life, I've been writing this book, Moon Theory, told you a lot about that, and I've come to this thesis,
which seems even more relevant like now, like when you told me about it, it's like I was like, okay, whatever, and then like start thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, that's actually like very relevant, and it's just becoming more and more and more and more relevant. So yeah, I think it's a really great place for that,
man. And as dharma, as really like, what am I, what in the heck could I do with this thing that I got that seems to be naturally oriented to noticing what's working, what's not working, almost engineering, as an engineer of sorts, of like, boy, that system is faulty. Like that's a system, and maybe it was relevant in a growth moment, but like we're not at that growth moment anymore. So the thing that I was coming back to is, as a thesis, it's been, reality is a holographic mirror of sorts that takes the shape as a reflection of your karma, or it is karma. It's like the quant, and working with DMT and the psychedelic integration, not from escapism, but from this place of like integral utility enlightenment, not enlightenment for the sake of like salvation on a future upcoming episode of My Life 101, but like on a now utility based state of well-being, which I feel like is a huge part of that, is understanding. I often see this thing not got, it's not understood, and it's like, wow, this is only showing up in life as a reflection. This is so back to what you're saying, is like the chakras being out of alignment is such a it's such a statement that's in the like the cultural folklore of, I don't know if it's just Western spiritual people, but it just sounds so segregated and unintegrated to me. It sounds like a manifestation of segmented identity, or separation identity emphasis, which I've put that as now a phrase every time I say ego, because ego is this separation identity emphasis plateau of sorts. But it's you said that the chakras, you don't got anything against them. I've been saying lately, it just keeps coming up, is yeah, like there's no such thing as spirituality as one. which obviously there is, but then by saying that, you kind of open up this opportunity to like,
Sure.
but then also this thing is, there's no such thing as Kundalini yoga, because and out of all the people in the world that I could have this conversation with, I'd love your reflection on it. But I keep saying it because I've heard it now come to me, and I don't know, because this one did yoga, and so now yoga is a conversation often, but it'll be said and you're like, oh yeah, I'm Kundalini yoga. And I was like, what do you mean by that? Well, Kundalini. I was like, what other kind of yoga is there? And they're like, well, I was like, and it just kind of developed in my system over time. It's just like, there isn't any yoga that isn't meant to augment, manipulate, or grasp and tangibly interact with that which is Kundalini. But that's all karma yoga. And you have this kind of multi-termed opportunity to distinguish, okay, like, was listening to Ram Dass, and it's like beautiful bhakti, but he's also ready to talk about jnana yoga. And I'm like, cool, these are dope designations, especially for a Western mind. It's like, that seems different than that. Are they the same thing? It's like, no, that's a defensive end, and that's a defensive tackle, and that's the offensive line. Like, they're all just football players, but like, no, these are actually specifically, different things for purpose, so that we can distinguish them and understand this. Maybe what could look like a chaotic football game, it's like, wow, it's actually very specific things that are happening here. So some kind of a baton back to you. I kind of been dropping the idea of question asking as much, and it's like,
sure,
I'm like holding a potato, and at some point she is cooking it and I can't hold it anymore in my hands, and then you just start cooking it in yours, or add butter or something.
Sure.
But
yeah,
this the baton is something around the idea of like, okay, here's a couple layers to it, is like, how does your yogic journey, and like going from your skateboard kid roots to like, wow, karma, I have some, I'd like to work with it, a little bit more consciously. Oh, yoga, that's potentially helpful system, cool. And how does personal karmic yoga, we're all doing karma yoga, I think that's a truth, but some can become more conscious and therefore more participatory in the interaction between the self, the jivatma, and that which is our karma.
Sure.
So yoga is this system that comes up. But I guess a cool question I was thinking about recently is, why do some cultures get ahead in their own karma yoga? And like, look at America right now, and you're in Malaysia, that's worth noting. Like, you're a Western, pale-skinned, New Hampshire. Wait, where are you from? Vermontian?
Vermont. Yeah.
A
Vermonter. Yeah.
You're a Vermontian European lineage man living in Malaysia, as a yoga educator. And from what I understand, you just went back to school. Is that what's happening right now?
I just finished school. Yeah.
Wow. So if you could maybe baton all those together, it's just like, well, maybe we just start on that. It's like, well, what, you're pretty karmically, infused. Why go back to school at this point? What's going on in your system that is mirrored in these years?
And then tie that all into Kundalini and karma yoga, right?
Yeah. The baked potato is ready.
Well, I think like basically it's because my chakras are imbalanced, so I probably had all that kind of nonsense. But
obviously.
No, I think, I've always been interested in this other, dimension's the wrong word. I always thought there was something conscious, like there was some type of consciousness, whether it was like, not necessarily God, like some dude sitting in the clouds, and
that was always difficult for even as a kid. I was like, but wait, so he's like a dude for real up on the other side?
Yeah, exactly.
I tried to,
and I didn't grow up religious, because I think my parents were so brought up religious that they were like, no way, that's not going to happen.
So you're in Vermont in 80s as a teenager, and your parents were kind of already off of religion, so you didn't get super pushed on from that.
Yeah, I grew up in the 80s, so like, like that was like growing up pre-teen. I was a teenager like in the 90s, but like, so yeah, or like, let's see, yeah, I was like 15 by the time it was like, 1990. So I was like, that was my youth, was the 80s, like late 70s, 80s.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So yeah, the 80s are pretty wild in a lot of ways, not necessarily like in a good way, but a lot of stuff came out of it, out of that particular point in life, and people were just doing things that were very different. I remember having conversations with like my uncle, who was like my dad's friend. He's like, when you get older, you're gonna have to wear like a suit and tie and all that stuff and go to work. So I think like the mentality of it was something similar to that, that you um, became educated, and people who educated work with their minds versus like laborers who didn't. So yeah, you're gonna wear like a suit, otherwise you can't. Like, and I was like, no way, I'm never gonna wear a suit, like that kind of thing. I did wear a suit actually in life for a period of time, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, in youth, like I always was very fascinated by like weird things. I remember like I used to live on a farm when I was a kid. So like when I was really little, I used to have to like take naps, and I would like take naps in my parents' bed and like put just the sheet over my head and like watch the sunlight come in through the window. And like, so I was always in a dream like state, I think, from youth, right? It was until I got a little bit older when I started skating. So that was probably like when I was in fifth grade or something, fourth, fifth grade, 1984-ish, that I remember having like this, again, this had to do with light, like feeling like sun on my body and just being like, oh, I wonder, like, kind of like what my relationship with God is or consciousness is, right? So I started meditating. Like no one in my family was a yogi. I didn't learn about yoga from anyone. I just knew that there was a such thing as meditation. I started meditating, and my parents were super open. They're very whatever, like that's cool, go ahead and meditate. And they would talk about all kinds of stuff like consciousness and ghosts and gods and aliens and all that kind of stuff. Not like all the time, but they believed in it, and it was just like a known thing. So next to my town is like kind of a res town. So my mom used to always go see this shaman woman. Instead of like seeing a counselor, she was seeing a shaman. So I think one of the validations that I had was one day I was just thinking like, oh, I wonder if this lady knows who I am. I don't know why I was thinking that. And my mom came home and said, hey, so-and-so wanted me to tell you that she knows who you are. And my mom's like, what does she look like? Why don't you draw her for me? So I drew a picture of her as a little kid. And then my mom's like, yep, that's who it is. Because I never had met this woman before. So from there, I knew that like there's something else going on rather than like what was on paper, so to speak, like what was in front of you, that there was like a way to connect to things. So once I knew that, I kind of just saw that everywhere, from like walking in the woods and seeing the way like water flowed through the trails or on the on the paths or what have you, to like just paying attention to things, like really just noticing. And then my inquiry became more and more and more about like consciousness and about your mind and all that kind of stuff. So I started practicing meditation, as I said. I started practicing breathing techniques. I didn't know how to do them, but I was like just breathing in, holding my breath. I could get myself to go out of my body and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't until like college that I found yoga. And I thought it was quite boring, actually. I took this college course from this woman who I think still teaches the same classes like yoga, meditation, and massage. And I really thought the yoga was quite boring. You're just kind of like laying on your floor and stretching your arms away from your legs. And I thought that was kind of boring. Meditation, I thought was amazing. It was like it was cool to learn new techniques. I actually like the massage a lot. That was really cool too, just like get in touch with the body. But yeah, by college, I mean, I think my generation, we were so taught so much that you would like, find all your answers through going to college, that if I had known now, I might be like, yeah, maybe you don't really need to do all that stuff. And maybe it's better to like spend some time wandering around from, state to state and figuring out what it is that you're going to do. But we did that. And, many people I know did that. So I very much learned something interesting, which is like how my mind works with things and what I was interested in, which was like so many different things. So I like changed my major like a million times and all that kind of. I did well in school, like because I like learning a lot. I still like constantly study and read and research and write, even to this day. But yoga was not like in my it was not interesting to me. I was not interested in yoga. I was more interested in meditation because I, at the time, didn't really know how those two connected, right? And then it wasn't until I moved to New York. I was working like on a job on Wall Street. I got off of that job because it was just like whatever. I did that for a while, and then I was like, oh, I'm going to try yoga. I think it will be like a good thing to do. And then when I found out that there was meditation and breathing and all these things in yoga, I was like, wow, this is cool. And then very quickly I met my guru, who then I took initiation with, and kind of the rest of that was initiation after initiation after initiation. So I went a very traditional route just because I wasn't trying to become a yoga teacher. I was interested in the actual yoga part. I was trying to become in touch with this thing that kind of felt always, present within inside of myself. That was more my aim. And honestly, that's the initiation aim too. So when you take initiation, for people who don't really know about initiation, usually the teacher will tell you when, the job is done, basically. It's not, the aim isn't usually to teach. The aim is to understand the methodology of the lineage and potentially get something out of it. We could call that samadhi or whatever it is, but the teacher will basically let you know when that time is. And they'll tell you usually by telling you to kind of leave me alone, which we don't. We think it's like, this warm embrace. Yes, you should always be around me and we'll be best friends forever. But I was always taught from all my teachers that, your relationship with your students is supposed to tighten, like you become more connected, but lighten. Your time together becomes less and less and less, because look at it like, a bunch of street lights, you can't have them close together. It makes no sense. You have like one, and then there's another one a distance away and another one a distance away. And that's how you illuminate, the neighborhood, essentially. Just hanging out together doesn't really work very well. So it's not a collective journey in that sense, where we're supposed to be occupying space with each other all the time.
I think that was one of the things that stood out to me, that it was custom tailored for the individual and less of a group. Like, here's a reason for bonding socially. And to your point of the chatty Cathys on the outside of the yoga studio after class, was like, that was somehow always unpleasant for me as well. Social anxiety was like prior to call it integral embodiment. I was interested in mental health because I had so much social anxiety that I was like, well, maybe I can just find like a spiritual kickflip to like nullify my anxiety. I just want less anxiety. And then, yeah, I think like an ayahuasca psilocybin experience was like, whoa, you don't have to just like put your bar at like, I want less anxiety. It's like enlightenment or realization of the utmost absolute is relevant for well, that's a great another question. It's like I noticed I was wanting something that was like not able to even really be talked about. Like it was a private thing. I think this is part of the other baton I have for you, but it's also something that has been my karma. It's like I'm young Rocco watching TED. And I mean, that's a big part of this. My initiation into, yoga through you is largely sparked by me watching TED, and even this podcast, and like so much is like, not everybody gets to have that opportunity to watch like someone that's kind of considered like career crazy or literally insane, but they're quote unquote famous because they do a craft so well. And that happens to be musical expression. And that also provides financial abundance. Like, it's a pretty rare situation. And I think I felt that to some degree as a kid. And I'm being like, what did this dude figure out? Or maybe doesn't even know he knows it. He's just is it. He's so interested in living it that talking about it isn't it. Trying to, I mean, I feel like I noticed young, like, he doesn't really have friends, does he? Yeah, well, the dogs. Yeah, like a couple Labradors, and then like his work, and like, a couple other things that is designated as his bliss. But so here's a cool baton. Why do some soul, and it's at the beginning of Light on Yoga by by what's his name?
Iyengar, yeah.
Iyengar. And he's like, and I remember that sparking me too, because I was like, you know, I'm 26-year-old Rocco, December 2016. I just come back to LA after kind of getting like removed because I couldn't pay bills, but then I left and I'm like, oh, I failed. My artistic dreams didn't come true. And then I dharmically kind of get invited back to the city. And I'm like, ooh, interesting. And then I'm there and I'm like, all right, new relationship. And I try this thing that is a yoga teacher training, meet you. And in the beginning, it says, read Light on Yoga, Iyengar. And one of the things that it says is like, there's different types of aspirants, people who aspire. And this immediately was like, whoa, I mean, looking at just my family karma. And I didn't have this language in 2016. I didn't say karma like that, but I was like, what is that thing that causes Ted or Bruce or Kanye to go incredibly insane with focus and with this cultivation of potential? The cultivation of potential was not with everybody. There were homies in high school that I just felt this decay of our relationship because the relationship was bogus. It was like convenient friendship to give us bonding when it was relevant. But then I just started seeing like, whoa, if I try to stay friends with this person, something is going to be harmed in me because I'm needing growth in a way that this soul is not interested in. So back to the core of the question, or the baton rather, is what is that? And what have you noticed that is the differentiation in different jiva atmas that cause certain souls, call it the soul or the I am, cause certain souls to want their karma unraveled or alchemized? What makes why, you know, obviously the gradient.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's I don't know if I have an answer to it. You know, I mean, it's funny you bring up all that stuff because I think when you're young, like, I don't think a lot of my friends were thinking about the same thing that I was thinking about, you know, like we bonded in like skateboarding. And honestly, how we bonded in skateboarding is they were all into like freestyle BMX, you know, kind of stuff. And I was like, why don't you guys skateboard? And they're like, no, you can't do anything on a skateboard. And then I like ollied over their bike and they're like, oh, cool. Next day they all had like skateboards, right? So like we became friends like that. But you know, you notice certain things. Like I noticed in my life that I was always sort of like, you know, ahead of the curve, which, you know, it seems kind of cool, but like it's not really cool because you do a lot of stuff on your own.
Yeah, it's a lonely place.
Yeah, and then like when people catch up to you, you kind of like, oh, I think I'm, you know, I'll do something else now. I think I'll do something else. This is not so interesting. So I'm not sure what like sparks you to, I don't know if you watched this, the new, it just like came out not too long ago, I think. It's like a series of Kanye documentary on Netflix. Have you seen that?
Just came out. I've seen snippets.
Yeah, it's crazy. So if you watch that, it's like, you know, you can, like, how can everyone hear? I mean, I don't know, maybe we could take a poll, but can everyone hear like what's happening from the beginning? Like you have to have an ear for it, right? Like in order to hear what's coming out. And so I don't know if everyone has an ear for it, or everyone has like the eyesight for it, or everyone has the taste for it.
Is that
it's
karma?
like, I don't know, maybe it could be. I mean, karma is supposed to be essentially your physical existence, right? So whatever capacity my brain has, however long my hands can reach and so forth, then that's part of my karma, right? It's physical as well.
How do you feel about the statement that how do you feel about the statement that each of our karma is the density of our koshas?
Yeah, because karma is technically, well, if not technically, but karma, you look at text, you have koshas for sure. I mean, koshas and karma go hand in hand, and when the koshas are not there, neither is your karma, neither is your physical matter. So yeah, your physical matter is tied into your energetic matter.
So I look at
the soul is supposed to be something different than the energetic matter, right? Because the soul is
comes into the matter.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can say that koshas essentially, even though they're subtle, are still subject to the elements. Whereas when matter. Yeah. So when they dissipate, the soul is there.
Do you have any overlaying framework with the term like the akashic records and the akashic framework of seeing karma like that?
The problem I do have with karma is that, like, I think some people can, a lot of people can have trouble with this too. Is like, what is it that allows me to be as a person? I feel like I have a lot of opportunities, and then I see other people who don't have opportunities or have more suffering. Like, how is that, okay in some ways, right? So when we look at karma, I look at it more physically in that way. And I've heard other people say this. Actually, my partner said this before. She's like, that's why I believe in reincarnation, because I don't think that it's fair that, if there is balance of some sort, or let's get rid of the word fairness, if there is balance of some sort, then it can't be that someone's born only one time just to suffer.
Man.
Right. So, I mean, that's a little bit more, easy to swallow to some degree. Like, I think all frameworks have problems, and karma is definitely like part of that problem, right? I think that we do have limitations, like, in our mind, we have limitations of our body, we have limitations of things, and they might not seem like limitations, but sometimes those are the biggest limitations. And you have dharma, like, which is, essentially like a purpose for being here and utilizing utilizing the tools that you have, which is karma, to, move with that, to engage in that, to move forward in life with that. The issue with dharma that we run into is that a lot of times we think about dharma as an occupational dharma rather than like a dharma that is an underlying dharma, meaning that it's a quality that occurs. Exactly. It doesn't. So like, if I got fired from my job, my dharma is not going to disappear, right?
Yeah.
I just might not be an accountant or a yoga teacher anymore, but like my purpose in life hasn't become shattered. And that's what I was talking about earlier with, like, having these different roles that we have in life. Can we get those qualities that sort of bridge those positions to come about, so that, it's like, yeah, Rocco's really nice guy when he's on an interview, but he's not so cool when he's teaching yoga, or like, it's not fun to make music with him, or whatever it is, right? Can we get that same quality, this unmutable quality to sort of like really show its thread throughout the multiple roles that we have in life? So I was always interested in that, because I think that is a really important thing to identify within yourself. And that if we're shape-shifting, so to speak, from position to position, or role identity to role identity, I think you have a hard time with your identity. So I was very much interested in that, like, what part of me is unchangeable or unshakable.
Yeah.
And if I take yoga into that, yoga automatically says, well, your body is not going to be around forever, which is potentially why some people do yoga, is to make your body last as long as possible, so that you can, tap into this internal aspect of yourself and become realized. You're not living multiple cycles of birth and death over and over and over and over again, which I'm not so sure that's true or not. I'm not, I'm still playing around with that, so to speak. So if I tie that into akashic record, do I think that we have like, an etherical imprint that kind of connects us from the beginning to the end? It's possible.
How about this? Let me know if this feels right or not right, but accurate. Accurate meaning, true. So as the Jiva Atma, we come out of the monad Purusha into material form with a body, skeletal, muscular structure. The level of unpleasantness that we have in our skeletal structure, mental, emotional structure, into our potential for embodying all that we are, which gets into the bliss body. The level at which we embody our potential creates a heat index that causes us to move through, A, burn through, B, or alchemize our what has been and what is into what can be. And this is to me the kind of overlay of what it is to become more conscious. It's like, it is as it is. It is as it is. Another, siddha signal of like, it is as it is. Well, then why? How come? Right. Exactly. Therefore, da 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 da. It's like karma informs dharma. Dharma informs karma. They're this like, it's a gripping it's a lock. It's like asking, that the hand wants to rest on the groove while rock climbing, and the groove wants the hand. It's like the magnetism there. And I think that's
sure.
That term has really stuck out to me, like electromagnetism. It's people talking about Christ, people talking about Buddha, people talking about akashic records, people talking about the quantum field. It's like electromagnetism. Electromagnetism, our state, how we feel, and how we're moving through that which is. Where I was going to mention as like a testimony marker of you kind of saying also some of the stuff that's happened to you along the way. I remember being like 10, and it was the last year that we stayed in our house in Michigan before they bulldozed it. And it was this like MTV Cribs house. Literally, it was on MTV Cribs, and it was a mansion, and it was the house that he built after he had me when he was 42 or something like that. And it's like, dude's pretty much already like legend status. Builds dream house. Rocco's born 1990. By 2000, it was bulldozed in dirt, no insurance money. So they had a big, but I remember we went to Africa pretty much every other year. And I was there, had my birthday. It was this huge like rock. And we had like, people brought tables up on the rock. Like I say rock, it's not like a mountain. It's like almost like I visualized like one of those Chinese type of rocks where it's almost like a flatter top. It's almost like a, like a big column of rock on the safari, like, landscape of Africa. And we had a birthday party up top. People brought all these tables up there, a big flat kind of tabletop top to it. And you hear lions roaring in the sunset. And I was like, man, just amazing experience. Impacted me deeply. Family was there and like in Africa, and it's like my birthday. And the guy whose name my parents gave me Rocco as a name because of this guy, Rocco Joya, who was a doctor who also had a ranch there in South Africa. It was a pretty lit moment. I get home and I remember being back in Concord, Michigan. And I had a friend that lived in a trailer with his brother and with his mom, and his mom and dad wasn't even together. And it was not the best, but I also saw some type of video of like suffering or something like that. And it triggered this experience that was from Africa, where this guy who was helping us with a lot of our stuff while we were there, his name was 140. And he had like 3 kids and his wife, and they were all in this hut that was no bigger than my bedroom. It was smaller than my bedroom in Michigan. And then somebody asked him while we were there, like, what do you guys think of us as like Americans with all of our luggage and stuff? And we come in and, and what do you guys think of us, or how do you see us? And he said, we feel sorry for you because you need so much. And it impacted people. And like, oh, that's so wise. And I remember being back in my bed as a kid, and I woke up from sleeping and I couldn't stop crying. And I had some relationship to God where I would speak to it because I saw people praying is a thing, call it God. Sure. And talk to it. It's called praying. And I was talking, and I was like, I felt ashamed, and I felt guilt, and I felt this burden of like, why would I have this nice house when what did I do to deserve this? And it was this overwhelm of like, how do I rationalize, or how do I understand why I would be given such nice things and such a life like this when, homie in the trailer in Michigan is never going to know Africa, and homie in Africa is never going to know the life that I'm living. It's like, why would I be given this? Became a young Rocco door handle into this pursuit, into this seeking that, in many ways led to, going to liberation yoga on La Brea at a certain point. But it, I didn't have the word. We were talking about this recently. It's like, there's no word for karma really in English. It's like a cause and effect kind of thing. I think Westerners look at it like.
For sure. Yeah. It's most associated with, you did something, it's going to come back to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Negatively. But you
Yeah.
listen to a lot of like Ram Dass or Terrence McKenna, and I think those are westernized frameworks that are also like totally blasted with divine light, and they're like they're symmetrical. And to me, it's like super mechanical. It's like, describe this situation. Oh, easy. It's called cup, ice cubes, liquid. It's very distinguishable. Okay.
Right.
Talk about the human soul, spirit, body, mind complex, and why anybody gets a certain amount of karma. Go. Speaking of this book.
Yeah.
So last part of the potato here. I look at it because I think it's an experiential, tangible like facility for me now. Karma is our gathered imprint on the material that we call life, and it's a gathered like momentum. It's
Sure.
it's like electromagnetic kinetic energy momentum. And why have I even took the moment to go into this as a conversation? It's like, and here is some, and then Ted is some, but it's like not everyone has been kind of pushed to that level of sensitivity for whatever reason. And there's a level of sensitivity that starts to draw upon a lack of tolerance. Heightened sensitivity requires lower tolerance. Heightened, lowered sensitivity, you're kind of more tolerant. But certain situations like this, we're young, we're like inquiring as to the nature of like, what the fuck is this here for? And I think out of necessity, as a utility of that which is, it's like, well, what is this? But I mean, man, past lives and akashic, all that, I think it gets really like spiritual ego vibes very quickly, unfortunately. But it's like everyone has a capacity, and if you're undercutting that capacity, you feel that kind of lack of fulfillment, and that sometimes leads people to despondency, or sometimes leads people to inspiration. But it doesn't always. It's not like a 1, 2, 3. Some walk away from it, some walk towards it. But
yeah, that's why kids can, like kids who grew up in the same household have very different experiences, right? Even if you're close in age, they experience their family upbringing differently, and obviously they're treated differently because they're individuals. But like, you can kind of like, it's maybe they're even similar in a way. They could be like identical, but their perception is different on how things happen or the way things go. I think that's what's interesting about karma is like, you are dealing with the materials. So obviously when we talk about yoga, we always know that your senses are faulty, right? I mean, one of the initial things that you learn in most yoga practices is sort of how to like control your senses to some degree, right? You're shutting your senses off if you're looking at Hatha yoga or Raja yoga, usually going through Hatha yoga to get the Raja yoga. So you're closing everything off, like you're learning not to pay attention to it. You're getting ekagrata or one-pointedness, right?
so you're not enslaved by it.
Yeah, because your mind is interpreting it. And then that's where you hear all the wonderful stories about, mistaking a snake for a rope in the room or the other way around, and feeling that it's real and, running out of the room because there's a rope in the middle of your room when really it's, a snake, or the other way around. Obviously, the other one is better than the other. It's okay to come back and be like, whoa, I thought that was a rope. Coming back and thinking it's a rope and it's a poisonous snake is another story, but that also can happen, right? Or like our sensory experience. I think you remember this story I used to tell you all in your 200-hour program was, you're running to the park and you're having like this amazing barefoot journey, and then you feel like mud go between your toes, and it's like you're absolutely in bliss. You're in heaven, feeling like this warm, material slide between your toes. And then you sit down on the park bench and you realize you stepped in dog shit. So you had this blissful experience a moment ago, and now you're like taking your, homemade crackers out of your snack pack and you're trying to like scrape all this dog crap off of your foot because all of a sudden the material is different than what you thought it was. So I think like our experiences are also subjective. Like we have how we want things to look and what it looks like. So we run into that scenario, and I think we'll probably always run into that scenario until you can like really not be so
Subjective.
particular on what that dream-like scenario is supposed to be. And this can happen in very small things, like people are like, oh, I want to live in the woods, and then they work really 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 hard and try to save up money and buy a place in the woods and live in the woods, when like their time might be best spent on just vacationing as much as possible throughout every single year to go and being in the woods, right? So we do that. Like our perception is like sometimes wired to these particular efforts where we have these experiences. So yeah, do I think that's part of your karma? It's possible. Another thing that pops into my mind, where like what comes into karma that we forget about, is like the intelligence of everything. Like that things are intelligent. Just because they're not consciousness, it doesn't mean that there's no intelligence in it, right? That we don't learn something from it. So often in yoga, there's this ideology that you should walk a perfect path rather than walk a path. And I don't know about you, but we tend to learn just as many things out of preservation, avoiding a situation. So preventative action versus one that you have to learn through trial, going through a difficulty, right? You come out like sometimes even more glorious from a difficult situation than you do avoiding a difficult situation. So we'll look at like growth and in what direction we're headed to. I don't know if there's a straight line, if there's like a perfect place to go. What also pops into my mind is, I can't remember what I learned this on, maybe it was like a radio lab, I kind of think it was, and they were talking about toxoplasmosis, and essentially that this organism has a pull on you so much because it's been around for so many thousands of years, that it'll make you want to like hug your cat and spend more time with it. It actually like affects your brain chemistry and makes you more affectionate towards the creature that hosts this particular disease. It can be a disease, for the person to become attracted to it. So there's intelligence in that, right? So if we're looking at the mind and we're looking at the things you surround yourself with, then potentially, yeah, you are learning those particular things. So what is it that takes one kid who, like you said, grew up in the trailer park, and the kid who next to him and the one who next to him becomes very successful and does all these things and travels all these places, and the one who doesn't, who's next to him, ends up in the same place that the other kid ended up, and they have the same circumstances? I don't know what the answer is to that. And I guess it depends on how you measure success. Just because you've been a lot of places doesn't really mean that you understand yourself, right? That's a whole other story, internal, external journey. But the Africa story is really interesting because I remember I had a friend who went on a trip, and I don't remember which country she was in Africa, but she was traveling to meet her friend, and she hopped on the bus, and the bus was completely empty. And then a woman hopped on and sat down right next to her. Now, as an American, most Americans, we kind of think that that's rude, have some spatial awareness. If a bus is completely empty, pick another seat. Ideally, maybe one all the way across the bus so that we have some space. So she got off the bus and she was like complaining to her friend, and she's like, oh, that's so sweet. And her friend was like, what are you talking about? It's so sweet. Well, the woman obviously knew that you weren't from here, and she felt you had no family. So she sat down next to you to make you feel more comfortable. Right. So perspective and perception is quite interesting. I think that's, also that can afford you from living in another country, like, Malaysians. It's hard to like, quantify what a Malaysian is in a lot of ways. I mean, it's hard to do the same thing with Americans and the French and everyone else. And we have these, stereotypes of who they are. In some ways it's reality. But when you really get into like living, and the way people, for instance, use language, or the way that you share meals, or the way that you create a community together, and those particular things, it's quite fascinating to see how people think, like how a culture thinks, how a collective thinks. And I noticed a lot, just because I've been going back and forth from Malaysia for, like about 6 years now, living here, but also traveling, and my, yogic life also, I traveled a lot too. But just the way simple things like, like when you're at the airport going through immigration, how like bands of certain people from different places behave just standing in line. Like a lot of us Westerners, or English speaking people will be like, oh my God, all these people are cutting. And then you'll see people from really populated countries and they're walking like two lines in where you would consider to be one line. And then there might be like a group of other people, like, they have signs and they're like, rushing all of their people to go to the front of the line, cutting everybody, right? So you're like, these perceptions often are based on our cultural perceptions on what we think is like appropriate. And when we see that in yoga, it gets a little bit scary because why is it that everyone should be like, eating avocados or like, consuming mass amounts of coconut products or like having a rectangular mat in order to like reach this particular thing. But when you actually like measure the yoga community, I wouldn't say that you're seeing like a disproportionate amount of enlightened people compared to regular people.
Feel that.
Right. So that's another issue. Is it potentially like, it's huge consumerism. If you look at it another way, if you look at it economically, it's $1 billion industry. So why are all these people spending their money on it? And, and also like just looking at it from a principle standpoint, shouldn't you as a teacher be teaching people to become independent, or interdependent at least, not codependent on methodology or whatever it is? I mean, I have clients that I go on and off with, but usually the methodology is that we work for a while and they can achieve something. I mean, this, and then sometimes they might come back in and check in, and then, but it's not like, okay, let's commit to each other for another 10 years, like there should be growth there. And then they go off and they might come back and there's growth and then go off and come back. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of intelligence in karma. I know I'm talking about two different things at this point, but I think that we tend to think that somehow with our mind, and maybe that's the biggest karmic trick of it all, is that we can kind of outthink all of this normal natural intelligence, which is, part of elemental or material intelligence. And then we're trying to match that or understand this other etheric or beyond etheric type of consciousness. And I'm not sure that we possibly can do that. Maybe some people can do that, but I'm not so sure that it's something your brain is going to perceive. Maybe death is when you actually understand that. Maybe that's the point of dying, is that you really have no choice, but that framework does stop, or you stop participating in it, right? And I talk about this a lot when we talk about energy, because we tend to associate with parts of our body, like our third eye or our heart or whatever it is, and all these things, which I think is kind of interesting because, before you have any of that, you're like a single cell. And no head, no heart, no feet, no hands, no mouth. And you're so pleased with yourself that you split yourself in half. And you keep doing that, right? And you keep doing it now too. So I think that's quite interesting. So I think if you're going to try to attain anything doing yoga, it's to try to tap into that initial energy for the fact that you decided to be delighted with yourself, right? I can't think of another word. It has to be delight. You have to be like, so just like, this is awesome. I'm energy. I'm going to like duplicate that. I mean, that's like Purusha and Prakriti right there, right?
Mm.
Yeah. As soon as you duplicate yourself, then you're now in a cellular pattern to continue to do that until you can no longer do that anymore. And then you're dismantled. Yeah. Or a part of you is dismantled.
Yeah, that's it.
It's quite interesting, right? If we could find that out, like, why don't I meditate on that? Meditate on conception,
Yeah, that's it.
But I think like bad thing, people always talk about like, you choose to, you choose like how you're born, I mean, sometimes I have a hard time with that. It's like, what if you're born through some type of violence? Did you choose that? Or was that your only choice? Was that the, your reason to come through? Maybe it is. Maybe you came through because you knew that woman, needed you. Like she really like could have, it turned her life around for you to be like, her son or her daughter. I don't know,
I've been given a recent kind of like spark on the emphasis, the helpfulness, how helpful it is to sometimes dehumanize any of these articulations. And I have a friend, Jamuna, who says it's really helpful not to make it human. Let's keep it as mathematics. And I'm like, man, thanks for that reframe. And he's like, yeah, it's just mathematics. Energy needed a certain situation to bring it forth in this particular way. And that's this perfect matrimony of scenario and the one in the scenario.
Right.
Which for me is that, Prakriti, matter, Purusha, spirit, it's the cause and effect, it's the duality thing, but it's like this calls you up to the plate to swing the ball and the bat, and then it's all one thing. But at some point, it seems like it gets jumped into activity because those mathematics aren't congruent, and they, through that contrast, they call us they call us forth. I know we're getting close to that hour point, but wanted to say one more like specific general kind of question, baton. Just for you as a person, like prior to yoga to now, like as a baseline identity, what has shifted? Not to make a case for yoga or anything, but like what is your own kind of, and what would you call it? Is that called integration? Are you more integrated now? Is there something that's, what is that main shift or adjustment since then?
Yeah, that's such it's funny that you're talking about, I started writing recently, or rekindling my blog after I, finished school, as we talked about earlier, to have more time to write again. But one of the things that I was talking about in this was, essentially the need for teacher training. Like, do you need to do a yoga teacher training? Is that possible? Like, is it a requirement? I mean, do you need to do it? So it makes me think automatically, like, what is the purpose of practicing yoga? What does it do? And for me, I didn't think about it so much. It wasn't a thought out thing. Like I said, I was just like, oh, maybe I should do yoga. It'll be good for me. I don't know what was happening at the time where I thought I needed something that was good. Do you know what I mean? Like that statement, obviously, if I'm having that thought, means that I was thinking I needed something to, like, bring some goodness into my life. And so maybe that goodness was integration. Maybe that goodness is integration. Certainly that does happen in yoga. And I do feel that. I feel that, from practicing yoga, it has, and I guess when I say practicing yoga, I also should be really clear about what that means, because we often think of yoga and we think automatically of physical practices. And I did do a lot of physical practices, but I would say that the energetic practices I did, and not Kundalini practices, but like classical Hatha yoga practices, a lot of bandha mudra, kriyas, tons of pranayama and meditation. Those are like the bigger part, and mantra. Those are the bigger parts of my practice. So when I talk about like being interested in yoga, that's what always sort of kept coming through, and not naturally. I remember when I was a young teacher, one of my teachers who I did training program with was like, oh, Will, we're going to go and see like, Krishna Das and these guys sing mantras. And I was like, okay, have fun. Like that's not for me. Like, I'm not doing that Krishna Das thing, Hare Krishna. And then I went to see my first guru, and the first thing he did is like, we sat down, we started chanting mantras, and I was thinking in my head, like, fuck, this is going to be the worst class ever, right? But I've always been a pretty compliant student, so I sang the mantras, and something like happened in my mind where I was like, whoa, how come I didn't like chant mantras all this time? Like, it seems like to be a pretty quick route to get there. And so in my yoga, I was really happy to be able to find that all of the practices that, encompass this body of knowledge had a similar effect to me. I could find those states doing asanas. I could find those states doing pranayama. I could find them doing meditation and all the other things. I was quite lucky. As a teacher, I realized that not all students felt and had that affinity towards all those particular yoga techniques. And I do like to call them yoga techniques because asana to me is not yoga, but neither is meditation and neither is pranayama. Those are tools, right, to get to a state of yoga. So I realized like, hey, well, if that's the case, then no tool is perfect. Because if I look at the tools as like, legs to a table, and this table has 4 legs, then one of the legs might be asana, but the other one might be pranayama, and the other one might be mantra, and the other one might be like some devotional service, but they all lead to the tabletop. And therefore, like crawling up any one of them is suffice to get to a state of yoga, which means that potentially you don't need to use the other legs of the table to get there. If you look at it in that way, it's still supported, it's still going to be there, but some people can understand all pieces to it. So I spent a lot of time isolating the practices to see which ones could, create a better result, so to speak. And then that's when I became really enthralled in the idea of like a sadhana being like a compounding practice, like that you could take certain breathing techniques and put them together and it just dumps you into a meditative state. Or you could take certain bandhas and asanas and do that and it like dumps you into a meditative state. Or you could use, alternate meditative techniques to get into those states. So I was like, wow, these things are all basically leading to the same thing. And so that type of integration happened for me where I was like, wow, there's certain, acupuncturists who can like give you a session and it like brings you to this state. There's certain people who can like massage you and brings you to that state, or you can hear certain songs or read particular words or like walk in a particular way through the park. I don't mean like walk in a particular way, but just happens to be the way you're noticing things are also bringing you to that state, right? And I think that's where this integration does occur. Yoga can make that happen, whereas like when we do other things, I think it's hard to integrate. Like I have nothing against like using substances like plant or otherwise to alter your state of consciousness, but I think the integration part is where a lot of people lack. They forget to like do the integration work. Like, how do I get that peak experience to work with me on my everyday, like in anything that I'm doing, right?
That was it for me.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't want it to be a visit. I would like it to be a sustainable utility, like not tactical, but tactile experience. I don't want to visit and then have depression because I'm leaving. I want to stay. Which he talks about that in this book too. He's like, he's the substances gave him he peaked over, but then he'd fall. And he's like, I want to get high again. And he'd fall. And then he met his guru and he was like, this guy's never falling. This guy's never not there. What is that? What is this? His testimony in here, like it's cool art in this book, Be Here Now book. But
the
first white pages section is like him talking about how the old identity was dismantled basically by this, call it spiritual journey. And then bloop, there's this new consistency. The material has augmented. There's like a new texture in its integration, I think.
Yeah, it's like that. Another analogy I give with like pranayama. It's like, if you go to the ocean, sea, whatever, and you take a glass of water with you, like you'll see all the fragments of the ocean. If I shake it up, it's like there's all the fragments of the ocean. We could say it's the mind or whatever we want to call it. It's what we identify with seeing. But yoga practice is like putting that glass, in a sink and then like pouring water into it. In the beginning, it aggravates all that stuff almost as much, if not more, creating a current, stirring that stuff up over and over and over again. But eventually it like spills out over the glass, and then like you have this physical visual change because all the sediment is gone. But you also have this other change, like you've gone from saline to non-saline water, which is like only really noticeable by you, right? It's like so it hits on those levels, like we're changing those things.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
It's just what we have as a everyday state, our mood, our state. You listen to someone like Abraham Hicks, she's talking about getting people into the vortex. She's not talking about yoga, she's not talking about atma, nothing. But she's talking about alignment. And I think what this process, and you pouring in, kick some stuff out, aggravate stuff. I love the idea of tapas. I send clients sometimes, if you want to know what the point of any of this is, put water in a pot, put it on a stove, and stare at the water with the heat on. What is happening? Now, why would anything cause you to be changed for the better or changed for the, do a couple, do a couple heroin benders or benders and see how it affects you. Probably not on the positive side. Maybe you're an outlier. And then maybe do some yoga practices and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I feel really aligned. This is a great. So these things bring us this way. These things bring us that way. I remember that was something magnetic to me about you, is just like, you're like, it's just a technique, dude. Relax. Cut the mental noise about it all away. But then you can see it more clearly for what it really is. And it's like, yeah, this is change stuff.
Yeah.
This used to be a different liquid of sorts. How does that feel? Or what do you notice about it? It is like that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely adjusting. I mean, because there's the idea behind all of this, like thinking of mathematical equations, is that that zero is perfect, right? It's perfect and it's complete. So you either have like a positive integer or a negative one that's going to take you to that. So we're not starting at the same place. Essentially, like some techniques can bring people like to this thing, but for some people it might be like removing techniques, right? Like taking things away. And so you asked me in the beginning, like what is the kind of yoga you teach? And I think I've struggled with that for a long time. I mean, I could say most of the time when I work with people yogically, whatever that means, it's often in the form of like mentoring or even counseling them to like readjust to whatever it is, because people are coming not to like learn how to do techniques overall. I mean, I get a little bit of that, but most of them know how to do it, so they're like adjusting their personal framework, trying to get zero. They want zero, right?
See clearly.
So sometimes it's cutting things out, and that's why I think yoga, like I said, it's also a system. Doing a lot of it doesn't get you closer to zero. It might actually like blow you past zero, and now you're in the positive aspect of this that you have to learn how to reduce. And I think that's life, right? We're kind of just doing this back and forth and back and forth. So the practice itself, I would say, does do a lot of integration. Has it made me a better person? I don't know if it's really made me a better person, as like I've become a better person in the world through yoga. I don't think so. But I've noticed that like putting a lot of energy towards yoga, for me, because it's such a creative process, does take away some of my other creative passions. Like maybe that's just the way I am. Like I immerse myself in things and kind of see how it goes. So, but a lot of times I was coming off of these other things too. Like you mentioned skateboarding, like, I've been like skateboarding for like 20 something years at the time when I started getting into yoga. So it's like kind of on the 2 decades of skateboarding. And I may still push around when I can, but like, where it was a big deal, then going into yoga, and then it was like all into yoga. Different things. I mean, skateboarding makes you look at things differently. To some people, it's just a set of cement stairs, or a big wall made out of concrete, or like a little gap that they should fill in because you could trip over it, or, it's just the hill I have to walk up to work every day. But when you look at it as a skateboarder, it's like, can I, fly off those stairs in how many different directions, or ride on the rails, or, can I slide down half this crosswalk, or ollie this gap, or the front of a car, or whatever it is, right? Like you just look at the world differently. So I think that I think perspective is good to have in general. And so, yeah, mundane experiences, I think, have a lot to offer us, because when we're talking to people that come from different places, whether they're, quote, fanatics of any sort, or they're just totally not interested in what you're doing, you can kind of see like what kind of person they are, essentially. Like, are they aligned inside because they're not doing yoga? Because that happens too. You see a lot of people like that know nothing about yoga. I don't know what this yoga thing is. That sounds interesting. And then they talk about all this stuff, and you're like, you don't need to do yoga. Right? As a tool, as a technique, you don't really need to do yoga. So I think that's, what I was more hinting at in the beginning is, spirituality is inevitable, because to my knowledge, according to this framework, every being has a soul. So there's already spirituality happening just through living.
One and the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, this is closer to 90 minutes than it is 60 minutes. So thanks for diving in. And
Cool.
yeah, I'm sure this will be episode 1 for us of if my podcast career goes anywhere like it does to Joe Rogan, I sense you being a more familiar guest than not. So yeah, thanks for
I
joining.
hope your podcast career goes wherever you want it to go, and that you
I
have fun along the way.
I trust that it will do exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Thank you, bro. Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Blessings and sing.